Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a very warm evening when the weather was very uncertain. I really appreciate that. Welcome to the fourth installment of our 2025 speaker series. Excuse me while I get the right glasses. All right, let's try that again. Okay. Tonight, in the ongoing process of bringing forward stories of Native people in Hatfield, we are focusing on the skill and knowledge of Indigenous medical practitioners. It is worthy, therefore, to acknowledge the thousands of years of Indigenous people who lived within this bend of the river, including members of the Pekumtuk, Nipmuc, and Wabanaki nations, as well as others. Members of these nations live throughout the Commonwealth to this day, and sharing the vast history of Hatfield from any point in the past is our mission. I'd like to thank the board for their steady support and all the volunteers who make events like this happen. Also, and importantly, this program is funded in part by a grant from the Hatfield Cultural Council, a local agency which is supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency. Are there any of the members of that council here today? Thank you, Deborah. Please do take a moment. You have surveys? Okay. So please do take a moment when you, after the talk, please do take a moment to fill out the surveys that Deborah has. They can be on a table right out there, because that helps the Hatfield Cultural Council decide which programs to fund next year, and we would love to continue programs of this quality. Lastly, thank all of you for coming out this evening. The Hatfield Historical Society is a membership-driven organization, so you are all cordially invited to join the Hatfield Historical Society. Membership forms will also be on the table, so it's a one-stop shop out there. And along with this wonderful table of books by tonight's speaker, which I hope you'll go, well, brought by you. Do consider following the Hatfield Historical Museum on Facebook. There's a guest book making the rounds. If you leave your email in that guest book, and we'll add you to the list, and you can get notification of other programs like this. Our next program, our next speaker event program will be September 18th at the Legion on the history of the Hatfield Hellion. So tonight, we are very, very glad to have with us Dr. Margaret Bruchek. Dr. Bruchek is a citizen of the Nulhagan Band of the Abenaki Nation, professor emerita of anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she founded and directed the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative. Her academic research has focused on critical analysis of colonial histories, museum collections, and cultural heritage, supported by grants from the American Philosophical Society, Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, School for Advanced Research, and others. For more than 3 decades, she has served as a consultant to New England museums, including Historic Northampton, Historic Deerfield, the Pekumtuk Valley Memorial Association, and Old Sturbridge Village, where she performed the living history in the character as Molly Geet, Indian Doctress. Dr. Bruchek also directs the Wampum Trail, a restorative research project designed to reconnect wampum belts in museum collections with their related Native communities. I'm so thrilled to introduce her. Please give her a warm welcome, Dr. Bruchek.
Kwai greetings. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge today is Juneteenth, the day when African American people living in Texas finally learned that they had been set free 2.5 years earlier. So let us think for a moment about what it means to have freedom. So that being said, tonight I share with you my talk with the Indian Doctress, Restorative Approaches to Interpreting Native American Medicine. And I'll start by introducing you to my alter ego, Molly Geet, the Indian Doctress. Molly and I are not, it should be noted, actual physicians, but over the course of more than 20 years, starting in the mid-1990s, Molly appeared in hundreds of living history performances at Old Sturbridge Village and other museums as a means to make 19th century Native lives, Black, Irish, Native American, and other, far more visible. Now, OSV historians were at the time doing a considerable amount of research to unearth new information about Black and Indian people as rural laborers, farmers, and domestic workers in New England during the early 19th century. The goal was to increase the accuracy of representation in the museum by portraying these people's lives as they were, embedded in, and certainly not marginal to, small towns like Sturbridge. Now, that research project drew upon multiple lines of evidence: primary source material, newspapers, reminiscences, correspondence, census data, town histories, illustrations, and material culture, especially baskets. Because you see, Old Sturbridge Village is a life-size living history diorama. It's a functioning farm and village museum staffed by costumed interpreters, including my husband Justin Kennick, looking rather shy on the side there. But the point is that many of these interpreters are speaking in third person about people in the past. And so I chose to portray Molly speaking in first person as a person from the past. So the Indian Doctress appeared in that setting as she would have historically, as a neighbor, a traveler, a skilled healer, and to some people, an object of suspicion. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. My intention is to share with you some of the insights that emerged from both researching and reenacting the Native past. Please do keep in mind tonight that I am only informing, not prescribing. I do not recommend that you try any of these plant remedies on your own for two reasons. One is that many of the most powerful Native medicines are also potentially poisonous. And the other is that many of them are rare and endangered due to the loss of sensitive ecosystems over time. So tonight's talk is in 4 parts. Part 1, Indigenous Medicines and Indigenous Healers. In literary and historical representations of 18th and 19th century New England, Native people were often cast as though they were seemingly vanishing Indians, living on the edges of Yankee society, eking out a meager living. And yet, a considerable number of Native people were highly visible, working as basket makers, itinerant laborers, and most relevant for tonight, as doctors, supplying their white neighbors with medicinal, material, and practical assistance as needed. So let's take a short walk through the history of some of these people to meet some of these historical Indian doctors, starting with this 1865 carte de visite of Molly Balassi, or Molly Molasses, a Penobscot woman. Like many Native healers, she was regarded as a powerful intermediary between the human and botanical worlds. Molly, as you can see, also crossed fashion boundaries by displaying both traditional dress, here exemplified by the peaked beaded cap on the left, and what she called her everyday wear, the fine beaver top hat with a silver band. Now, some Native healers were more than willing to disclose the remedies and the details of their practice, but many of them were quite secretive. For example, in 1807, Henry Tufts described the Pequawket Abenaki Indian doctress Molly Ockett, saying, "My kind doctress visited me daily, bringing new medicinal supplies. Frequently was I inquisitive with her and other professed doctors to learn the names and virtues of their medicines. In general, they were explicit in communication, but I knew them to be in possession of secrets they cared not to reveal." Now, one of many testimonies to Molly's skill came about in 1800 when she and her family were camped near Troy, Vermont. Samuel Sumner, author of The History of Missisquoi Valley, written in 1860, reported that when a severe bout of dysentery broke out among local white families, Molly was the only person who had an effective remedy. But she insisted on preparing it in her own camp and brought it in a pot to each of her patients and refused to divulge the ingredients. But the following winter, a Mr. Josiah Elkins was passing through Derby, Vermont, when he met with Molly, traveling alone, scantily supplied with provisions and having nothing but a little bread in her pack. Elkins immediately opened the barrel of salted meat he was carrying and carved out a 6-pound chunk to give to her. Molly was so grateful that she immediately shared her prescription. "Now you have been so good to me," she exclaimed. "I will tell you how I cured them folks of the dysentery." and she taught him how to make a decoction from the inner bark of black spruce. Now, this was not an unusual case. During the early 1800s, most New Englanders, regardless of their ethnicity, would turn to Indian doctors as an important alternative to the emerging practice of modern medicine, which was at the time widely known to be quite expensive and quite dangerous. Because you see, the men who practiced what we call modern medicine at the time were experimenting. They typically relied upon bleeding, blistering, purging, and poisoning, with liberal doses of mercury and opium. Patients were as likely to die from the treatment as from the disease. Native medicine practices, in dramatic contrast, were inexpensive, holistic, and far safer, resting upon intimate understandings of the relations among specific illnesses, foods, plants, and ecosystems. Now, herbal medicine was not unknown to European colonists. Colonial settlers recognized the value early on. One medicine that was being shipped to Europe in large quantities was sassafras, a spring blood tonic. In 1698, Gabriel Thomas wrote from Virginia, "There are many curious and excellent physical wild herbs, roots, and drugs of great virtue, such as sassafras and sarsaparilla, so much used, which makes the Indians, by a right application of them, as able doctors and surgeons as any in Europe." And not incidentally, sassafras was used for what they called the French disease. The French called it the English disease. And there must have been a great many people inflicted with syphilis back in Europe because they shipped a lot of it. Now, European colonists did bring with them some knowledge of remedies from the old country, but the efficacy and skill and safety varied with individual practitioners. Some plants duplicated the properties of known European plants, like the lady slipper or moccasin flower shown here, which, due to its calmative effects, came to be called American valerian. And by the way, you'll note that tonight I'm using common names rather than scientific names, in part because that's how the plants were referred to in the time period, and in part because many of those common names tell you something about the plants themselves. So in rural communities, women of whatever nation would readily turn to an Indian doctress, trusting her ability to ease female complaints and lessen the risk of childbearing through the use of plants that came to be called squaw, meaning woman in the Algonquian language. Blue cohosh, trillium, raspberry leaves, bloodroot, wild ginger, squaw vine, squaw root, squaw bush, etc. Now, Western Massachusetts was home to several quite famous Indian doctors. Two of the best known from the late 1700s through the early 1800s lived in Indian Hollow, which has now been flooded by the Nightville Dam. Now, they were Zebulon Fuller, 1744 to 1808, and his sister Rhoda Rhodes, 1745 to 1841. The two of them traveled a regular circuit on horseback from their home in Indian Hollow to the towns of Hartford and Windsor, Connecticut, and also to Westfield, Springfield, and even Northampton, Massachusetts, often staying in the homes of patients while on the road. Rhoda also employed local women as cooks in the preparation of native foods like corn, beans, squash, and venison for visitors who lodged in her home while being treated. One frequent visitor was Reverend Warner of Springfield, who stayed a week on his first visit and then returned every year. Now, in the 1830s, Zebulon was very likely the Indian doctor who had been challenged by Dr. Chauncey Brewster of Springfield. A neighbor recalled, "A certain Indian doctor had charge of a patient who did not improve to the satisfaction of his friends, and so they called Dr. Brewer as counsel with others, and decided that the treatment was not appropriate. The diagnosis of the case and directions for treatment were written out in the Latin language, and the friends were directed to lay the papers before the Indian and ask his opinion. When the Indian came to see his patient, the papers were presented to him. The Indian then wrote out in the Indian language directions for the white doctors to follow, and quietly bade them goodbye. With the shrewdness of the joke, all were pleased. The patient recovered." Now, this life-size diorama, which we set up at Old Sturbridge Village back in the 1990s, depicts Rhoda's home as it was described in 1836 by Brookfield printer Homer Merriam. Merriam wrote that out of desperation, he decided to try the skills of an Indian doctress to cure his chronic dyspepsia. He lodged for a full month with Rhoda, whom he praised as having a good knowledge of roots and herbs and their medicinal properties and a good degree of skill in the use of them. Now, this diorama is one way of looking at what a native home might have looked like. This one's a little better. I consulted on this one from the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. And many native people lived in little farmhouses very much like this one, often called small houses. Merriam described Rhoda's house as, quote, one room was a storeroom only, the other was kitchen, parlor, and the old lady's bedroom. The visitors, of which there were often several, slept in the attic. Her son gathered roots and herbs for her and prepared them, and she had quite a reputation of having cured or helped a good many people. One of her neighbors, Deacon Ellis, recalled, old Rhoda could cure anyone outside of the grave, and even them who'd lain in it only a little while. Now, Myron Munson, the town historian, was interviewing people who knew Rhoda in the 1800s, and he was told of one incident when, quote, a little girl suffered an attack of nasal hemorrhage. Physicians were summoned, but their efforts were unavailing. Dr. Rhoda was called. Entering the sick room, she looked at the imperiled child and issued an order, get me a hoe, and off she ran to a wet spot, dug up some sort of root, returning gave it to the little patient with the bidding to chew as fast as she could. The bloody flux slackened and soon ceased. Now, the plant she used was Trillium erectum, also known as wake robin, squaw root, Indian balm, birth root, and nosebleed. Rhoda called the red Trillium go papoose and the white Trillium come papoose for their ability to stop or start uterine bleeding. Now, one of the most effective medicines used by Rhoda is actually known by the personal name, of a Mohican Indian doctor, Joseph Pye, whose given name was Shothqueathquat. C.S. Rafinesque, in his 1828 Medical Flora, recorded that the name was given to Eupatorium purpureum in New England from an Indian of that name who cured typhus with it. Mohegan medicine woman Gladys Tantaquidgeon noted that this plant, also called purple boneset or gravel root, was one of the more highly regarded herbs by most native tribes in the Northeast. Joe Pyeweed reaches the height of bloom in mid-August, the time when typhoid and other summer fevers tend to run rampant. It's a classic example of one of the key tenets of Indian medicine, that the best cures are often growing fresh where and when they are most needed. Now, Dr. Rhoda used a wide range of plants, and Myron Munson described her materia medica as follows. As an apothecary, she gave prominence, let us say preeminence, to plants, flowers, and roots as remedies. She searched the meadows, swamps, and woodlands for medicinal vegetation that was growing wild, but her pharmacopoeia was by no means limited to such. It is remembered that she cultivated a great variety and abundance of medical herbage on the Fuller Place. Every kind of flower that I ever saw grew in her garden on numerous small terraces still visible, and they grew most luxuriantly. There was a complete mass of bloom from the old road to where the new one is now, and to the stream. These flowers were for use in making the extract. And by the way, when it's not underwater, the hillside next to her home is still abundant with these flowers even today. The mass of herbage was boiled down to a tar-like substance measured out in clamshell-sized doses to be diluted for further use. When treating patients in person, Rhoda refused payment of more than a token sum for her cures, in most cases only accepting a single copper penny. And one of her neighbors later recalled that Rhoda liked to wear her wealth, because what she would do is drill a hole through these pennies and then sew them to the hem of her skirt, so you could hear them jingling as she walked along. And about a decade or two ago, an archaeological dig in Deerfield outside the Hall Tavern found 2 pennies from around the 1820s, both with holes drilled through the middle of them. And Bob Painter, the archaeologist directing the dig, said to me, "This makes no sense, because once you alter a coin, it's no longer legal tender." And I said, "Aha, but it is very decorative, and it might be a sign that Rhoda was here." Now, the cures used by Rhoda included the following. This is by no means a complete list, but it gives you a sense of the wide range of plants that were being used and what they were used for. And many of them are still used for these purposes today. So she had relaxants, stimulants, actually she and her brother both, astringents, bitter tonics, laxative, diuretics, antitussives, expectorants, nervines, emmenagogues, demulcents, muscle relaxants, dyspepsia, blood purifiers. So as you can see, a far cry from bleeding, blistering, and purging. Or maybe I should say purging only when absolutely needed. Now, the Rhodes family also managed a maple grove, as did most native people in the time. And these were usually communally held and communally harvested. And one local observer wrote, about the middle of February is the time when the Indians leave their habitations and go with their families into the woods to make their year's stock of sugar. The season for this business lasts till the end of March and sometimes middle of April. Now, here the maple sugar was considered not a luxury, but an essential food. It was used as the primary seasoning for roasted venison, game, or fish. Maple sugar was also mixed together with parched corn, jerked venison, and dried berries, collectively called pemmican, as a traveling food. The maple trees were tapped with wooden spiles made from either sumac or from wood, and you remember making this particular spile or the trough? I think you remember digging out that trough?
I didn't. I just drilled the hole in the tree.
He drilled the hole in the tree. There's a whole series of processes involved. But this is Old Sturbridge Village, where every year we do maple sugaring. And what you see in the upper corner is a birch bark mokuk, which are the kinds of baskets that native people used for collecting and harvesting the maple sugar, because it was boiled down from sap to sugar. Syrup was an intermediate stage that didn't keep very well. It could easily go moldy, but sugar would keep for a very long time. Zebulon and Rhoda always carried extra sugar in their saddlebags, giving it out to children while traveling. In 1871, an elderly man from Northampton recalled, Rhoda was very kind to children, and her sugar box was emptied oftener by the lump she gave us than any other manner. Old Rhoda understood what she was dealing in much better than many modern doctors. She cured permanently many cases that were given up as hopeless by eminent physicians. Now, Rhoda was so well loved by her non-native neighbors that when the Stockbridge Mohican tribe moved, ending up out in Wisconsin after a series of removals, Rhoda was invited to join them, but she stayed behind. Her sons Zebulon and Simon traveled to New Stockbridge in Oneida Territory, but Rhoda insisted on staying right there in Indian Hollow. Her daughter later recalled, we did not separate from the tribe left us. Now, when Rhoda's health began to fail, when she reached old age in her 90s, her son Simon returned from Wisconsin and came back to Indian Hollow to care for her. The two of them were buried together near the homestead, and a local friend paid for the headstone. When Indian Hollow was flooded in the early 20th century, the graves were relocated to the cemetery just outside the Nightville Dam. And now on to part 2, the Indian doctor meets the Yankee physician. In 1837, another Indian doctor, an Abenaki man named Louis Watso, met up with a rather famous white doctor, Stephen West Williams, when he was visiting Deerfield, Massachusetts. Now, at the time, Deerfield was a relatively small town, and the group of native people that came to Deerfield would have looked very much like this. This happens to be a photograph from 1880, but it's pretty typical of a native traveling camp of the time. So you can see native people are wearing a wide array of clothing, mostly cast-off European clothing, and tents, and making very fine baskets for sale. Now, local newspapers describe the Watso family of Abenaki Indians as comfortably well off, having several horses and wagons, and a goodly supply of blankets and buffalo robes. And this is at a time when few people in Deerfield owned wagons, let alone buffalo robes. Now, when Dr. Williams wrote up his report in 1849 on the indigenous medical botany of Massachusetts, he cautioned his readers against, quote, the marvelous stories of illiterate old women and Indian doctors concerning the virtues of plants. And he claims sole authority on the subject, having, quote, endeavored to draw useful information concerning the medical virtues of these plants. He also denounced Rafinesque's medical flora, suggesting, quote, "The virtues of the plants described by him depend rather too much on Indians to be considered absolutely established." And yet, Williams himself depended on Indian doctors. His herbarium, now in the collections of memorial libraries in Deerfield, contains dense evidence of that dependence. The leather portfolio contains 556 dried specimens, 411 of which are indigenous: Joe pieweed, slippery elm, ginseng, cohosh, goldthread, Indian hemp, sassafras, etc., which were at the time all found growing wild around Deerfield. The samples he listed in his report included Asarum canadens, wild ginger, some, and okay, we're good. And he noted, "This is useful in the low stages of fevers, in nervous palpitations, and similar complaints. When a company of Indians were in Deerfield in 1837, I was much affected with palpitations." Sorry. Yeah, we'll just... There we go. "And they were much offended with me because I would not take one of their preparations which contained a large proportion of this snake root." And I like to think about this encounter. Williams wanted the knowledge, but he really didn't want to be treated. He refused the offer. He also refused to credit Watso with having any scientific knowledge. And when I tried to figure out how that could be, a very telling answer came about in Williams' own. "With all our improvements, the tendency of the times is downwards instead of upwards. The mass of the people believe more in Indian doctors and astrologers rather than in regular physicians. Within a year or two, I've seen hundreds of my fellow citizens chasing after a part of a tribe of Indians for the cure of their diseases. They pretended to be able to cure all diseases by their simple remedies, and the people believed them. The chief of their tribe was called a physician." So to put this in the context, Deerfield at the time only had roughly 2,000 people in the entire population. So if hundreds of them were going to the Indians rather than the learned medical doctors, that kind of tells you something. The other thing to keep in mind is that Dr. Williams was one of the founders of the American Medical Association. In his zeal to professionalize the discipline, he clearly resented the competition from people he perceived as his social inferiors. Another famous Indian doctor who did not visit the valley was Watso's niece, Emma Camp Mead, who recognized the need to license and market her cures to protect against the extractive nature of white practitioners. Although Emma herself dressed in very fine modern fashion, she utilized popular print imagery to market her wares, depicting Wild West Indians on her packages for Camp's cures and identifying herself as male on those packages because people were more likely to trust men. Why? I cannot tell. And now we're on to part 3. So part 3 helps to explain why we lost so much of this knowledge due to not just the lack of recording information, but the way information was distorted. As the 19th century progressed, there was a great deal of confusion between and competition among real and fictitious Indian doctors. Since native cures included medicinal springs, some Indian doctors and some fakers set up practices at resorts like Ballston Spa, Saratoga Springs, and Poland Springs. Meanwhile, white doctors, both amateur and professional, rushed to capitalize on the popularity of Indian medicine with books like The Indian Doctor's Dispensatory and The Indian Physician, and many others. Another Williams, Dr. John Williams, in his book titled Last Legacy, emphasized the primitive setting of this research, testifying that, quote, "For years he plied himself in the wilds of America, among the natives of the forest, where he underwent all the horrors and deprivations incidental to savage life to learn Indian cures," end quote. The problem was, anyone with access to a printing press could claim to be an Indian doctor. For example, a white woman in Boston, Mrs. M.N. Gardner, capitalized on native knowledge by packaging her medicine under the names Indian Balsam and Indian Doctress, and advertising them alongside an illustration of a native woman in the Massachusetts Spy newspaper. Some Indian doctors took to the printing press to protect themselves. Some went on the road as they traveled across New England, making baskets, practicing medicine, and putting on entertainments. And this, incidentally, is the Newell family of Penobscot people who were real Indian doctors. And they make a point of saying on this poster, as you can see if we look at the close text, a white doctor says that his medicines cure all diseases, but Dr. Newell does not believe it. For there are many white doctors who say they learned from the Indian doctors the art of doctoring in the Indian way, when in fact they know nothing about it. They advertise largely what they can do and put on the Indian name, but when called upon for a trial, it is found they are very different from the genuine Indian doctor, and that their seeming knowledge is nothing but false pretension. And I should note that Indian doctors also competed with one another at times. At Great Falls, New Hampshire, for example, Susan Newell, the sister of this Dr. Newell, was indignant to discover that an unscrupulous printer had replaced her name with the name of one of the men of the company, who hoped to capitalize on her reputation. And then there was Samuel Thompson, I should say, a self-described poor, illiterate farmer who claimed to have independently discovered the secrets of botanical medicine, while also admitting to having learned his skill from an unnamed Abenaki Indian doctress in Vermont. He claims sole copyright for the use of lobelia, the plant he is holding in this plate. It has been said by Dr. Thatcher that lobelia was employed by the Aborigines and those who deal in Indian remedies and others who attempt to rob me of the credit for having discovered it. They cannot produce a single instance of its having been employed as medicine until I made use of it. When in fact, lobelia was quite well known. It was commonly called Indian tobacco. It was used in a number of smoking mixtures, and it was not something he discovered. The variety called Lobelia syphiliticum, in fact, was another cure for the so-called French disease. Lobelia was also widely used in water cures, including at the water cure place in Northampton, where steam bathing with hot water and sweating herbs was said to produce a remedy. That particular practice was inspired in part by the Algonquian Indian sweat bath, used by Native people for spiritual as well as physical healing. In fact, when we take a look at Dr. Thompson's Materia Medica, you'll recognize some of these plants, because his classification, including what they were used for, duplicates much of what the Indian doctors were in fact using. Now, although Thompson was ridiculed by trained physicians, his particular system of publishing and patenting unfortunately inspired the ever-increasing search for profitable native pharmaceuticals. The Shakers even entered the business by growing and selling large quantities of pure botanicals, including both native and European plants, with no acknowledgement whatsoever of native knowledge. The Sabbath Day Lake Shaker community, for example, still markets their plant products as, quote, gourmet culinary herbs, herbal blends, spices, and herbal teas that represent our long and continuing heritage. Our herbs are grown in gardens more than 200 years old, dried in a facility built in 1845, and packaged in tin canisters just like those used by our forebears, with no mention whatsoever of the native people they learned it from. And then getting even a little stranger, as native medicines were being packaged and marketed, hucksters were increasingly willing to sell questionable compounds of liquor and bitter herbs as cure-alls and tonics, capitalizing on the inherent trust in native remedies, turning Indian doctors from live healers into advertising images based on prevailing stereotypes. Further confusing the matter, some Indians turned to marketing patent medicine. In the 1880s, a Penobscot man named Charlie Daylight joined up with John Johnson, Kiowa Chief Rolling Thunder, who was not actually Kiowa, and Frank Loring, known as Big Thunder, to market Helian Bigelow's Kickapoo Indian Oil, hawking cheap remedies. I'll just give you an image of that. Hawking cheap remedies to draw customers alongside traditional techniques to cure them. These Indians were not actually Kickapoo, but the name had a poetic ring to it that seemed to shout exotic. One newspaper reporter actually wrote about it. Kickapoo Indian oil, Kickapoo Indian juice, Kickapoo blood tonic, couch cure, and worm remedy were standard products of the company. And inasmuch as the contents could be mixed and bottled backstage for about 7 cents each and the dollars taken in as fast as the bottles could be handed out each evening, the show was a gold mine for its owners. The stirring eloquence of Dr. Johnson, quite as much as his picturesque character, was an invaluable aid to the show. And these became wildly popular at county fairs, at state fairs, anywhere you had a cluster of people, you'd see somebody selling patent medicines. But I digress yet again. My point is that these patent medicines, when combined with the myths of Indian disappearance, the erasures in local town histories, and the actual bias and violence against living Native people, obscured the real histories, the remedies, and the human interactions. Why have we forgotten these Indian doctors and doctresses? How did their stories become so disconnected? And how can we recover them? And that takes me to my final section, part 4. Embodying the Indian Doctress. So to address those questions, when I took on the role of Molly Geet at Old Sturbridge Village, I took on the challenge of reenacting the role of an Indian doctress, knowing I had rather large shoes, or I should say moccasins, to fill. I spent months researching, reconstructing, and testing clothing, props, gestures, and language to create a character that went far beyond a mere costume performance. And as I said earlier, OSV is a living diorama, a selective amalgamation of buildings, both original and constructed, characters, both authentic and invented, on-site industries, and interpretive choices that reflect whose stories are heard and whose are left out. The Indian Doctress, shown here along with farmer Rich Giordano and interpreter Guy Peartree, shown here portraying Guy Scott, one of the black men living in the village at the time. But the Indian Doctress was unusual. A woman with her hair down, wearing a man's top hat, a person of color in an overwhelmingly white New England village. And the practice of embodying Molly Geet led to multiple opportunities to experience diverse lifeways at a different time, including trying my hand at basket making, which, to be honest, I was never particularly good at. I'm much better at making noise than making baskets. While recreating these historic images, I also tried to recreate historic experiences while walking through the landscape and through the seasons. I led regular walking tours along the roads, in the forests, through the fields, winter, spring, summer, and fall, for more than 20 years. And at one point, writer Howard Mansfield followed me around and wrote a lovely article about me for Yankee magazine. And he said what impressed him the most was how the people on my tour suddenly stopped and looked up at a grove of pine trees as though they had never seen them before, because they were hearing a new way of understanding that they were medicinal as well as beautiful. Now, whether working with staff, student interns, or visitors, I introduced folks to the astonishing range of native medicinal plants: Joe Pyeweed, sassafras, sweet fern, boneset, goldthread, and many others, growing wild on OSV's hillsides and roadsides. And there were times when I was the bane of the utility crew, because I would tell them, please don't cut this tree, please don't clear this road, please don't plow this field, because some particular medicinal plant was growing there. But the staff was really quite lovely about welcoming interactions with Molly. My walks became popular events, but I still found that most visitors were quite astonished to encounter an Indian person in an 1830s Yankee museum. And so the questions I was battered with are, in retrospect, quite amusing. Do you sell snake oil? Didn't all the Indians die off? Is that your real hair? Are you a witch? Frankly, I can only answer yes to one of those. I'll let you guess which one. I portrayed Molly as a pleasant woman who would doctor just about anybody, including one of the local farm cats who really took to me. That was Gray Boy. But my primary goal was to doctor people's misperceptions, to overcome the erasure in public memory of New England Indians, to restore some understanding of the individual healers who were integral parts of these communities. And I quickly realized that my real task as an educator, performer, and herbal healer was to repair the rift between fantasy and reality, to bring the past back into contact with the present. And so in character as Molly, I could invite visitors to walk with me into a world where the plants still talk to the healers, where the Indian doctors know something the Yankees don't about medicine. During maple sugaring season, I occupied the small house, cooking and boiling down maple sap to sugar, and I developed quite a command of the kitchen, especially when cooking rabbit, venison, corn porridge, succotash, Jerusalem artichoke, and other native foods. And I especially loved Thanksgiving when everyone else was doing a big turkey feast, and I was busy cooking a rabbit on a string over the fire. Now, I often had to remind people that wandering was not equivalent to homelessness. Native people in 19th century New England had a great deal of autonomy and freedom, and many, of course, had their own homes. Native homes were outfitted with native stuff, but so were non-native homes. In fact, many aspects of everyday Yankee life in the 1830s, from the brooms used to sweep one's floors, to the rush seats on chairs, to the baskets that held farm products, to the rye and Indian bread on the table, reflected encounters with native technology and native knowledge. Now, we still have much to learn about and from those Indian doctors and doctresses who practiced what we would recognize today as herbalism, homeopathy, chiropractic, and physiotherapy, in addition to psychotherapy and spiritual healing. Their knowledge went far beyond mere pharmacology, including teachings about proper times and places and applications of. And, not incidentally, I learned even more about Rhoda Rhodes after OSV decided to feature Molly Geet on the cover of the museum magazine. And I used to say I always wanted to be a cover girl. I never imagined I would be squatting in a patch of skunk cabbage when it finally happened. But I received a letter from a Mohican Brothertown Indian woman named Janet Gerzabowski who lived in Wisconsin. She wrote to me that in her family tradition, she was said to be descended from an Indian doctress in Western Massachusetts, but she knew nothing else about her. When we met up in person at OSV, Janet, who as it turns out is Rhoda's 5-time great, accompanied by the Brothertown Indian tribal historian Carolyn Andler, one on the right. They shared a large collection of photographs, biographies, and other surprisingly dense records of Rhoda's descendants from her grandchildren right up to the present day, but they had almost no knowledge of Rhoda herself. And so later that week, I took them out to Indian Hollow. We went on a pilgrimage together, visiting the remains of Rhoda's home site, which are just a few tumble-down stones, in company with Jennifer Lee, a local native historian and basket maker. And so my point is this. Over time, Native people became forgotten. Their stories seem to have been lost, but Native lifeways, foodways, and medicinal traditions became part of Yankee culture across New England, particularly among folks who sugar in the spring, gather berries in the summer, and harvest and hunt in the fall. Rhoda Rose, Louis Watso, Emma Mead, Maliakat, these are just a few of the many thousands of Native American histories that, although they are deeply embedded in the rocks and forests of this landscape, seem lost in time. But the Native families who remain in New England, living near their original homelands, still hold tightly to sacred places, oral traditions, family stories, and memories that connect past and present. Native communities are now increasing their efforts to protect special places, especially medicinal knowledge, biological resources, and endangered ecosystems where these powerful plants once thrived, recognizing them as collective other than human allies and heritage. And so by gaining better understandings of Native medicines and lifeways, and by recognizing the influence of indigenous knowledges in the present, we can also begin to deconstruct the selective nature of the stories we tell one another about ourselves and about our ancestors in these places over time. Kutsioliani, thank you. Walinanawalmazi, be
Okay, and I think this mic is working because we switched off and John came up. So if you have questions, if you raise your hand, yeah, thank you. Why don't we,
I'll take this one. You
are
carry
they
that
both
around?
working?
Okay.
Yeah, you keep the one that's working
Okay.
good.
I got it.
I'll travel around. Raise your hand if you have a question. So this is how I'm going to get my steps in for today.
What kinds of plants might have persisted when Native people might have been relocated forcibly or migrated? And of course in New England, but the different kinds of habitats, or just what was really preserved as some of the most important healing plants.
So I won't answer that in detail, but I will tell you an interesting little factoid. In archaeological work, when you find a very dense concentration of red sumac and Jerusalem artichoke and an abundance of boneset and Joe pie weed, you're probably looking at what was once a native homestead. Because Jerusalem artichoke, which is an odd name in itself, sunchoke is what many people call it today, but it's a food plant, it's a medicinal plant, it's a natural source of insulin. And I found it so interesting that the first time I went to Indian Hollow, at a time when it wasn't flooded, the area was just thick with Jerusalem artichoke. And as you saw on that hillside, all those plants growing. So there are many plants like that that are abundant. But the ones that are endangered are a little more elusive these days because they often tend to need dense deposits of forest, leaf litter, and over time you just need that buildup of soil to get particular plants to grow. So at Old Sturbridge Village, for example, there was one spot on the road up to the hillside where there was an abundance of gold thread. And then at one point the maintenance crew came in and said, we need better drainage on this road, and away went all the gold thread. And similarly, sassafras, if you leave it by itself, it will grow and fill an entire area. But European harvesting took the entire tree when the most medicinal part is the roots. And with harvesting sassafras, you can actually find a fully mature tree, kind of sketch a circle around it in the soil, then follow the big tap roots out, cut off the few feet off the end, and leave the tree standing. And so many native methods of harvesting were selective. So people would take a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit everywhere else, but never take an entire cluster of plants. And that's actually why even now I recommend people not to harvest wild plants, because many people don't know what they're doing. It's easy to damage them. It's easy to damage an ecosystem. And there's a new fad now for wild harvesting foods. And it's like, seriously, animals, birds, insects, snakes, reptiles, they need that food. So we can go to the grocery store, they can't. So I often say, it's interesting to know about, but be very, very careful about what you take. I saw another question out there. Another hand up?
Other questions?
Yeah.
As a medical provider, are there messages that you would like us to convey? Are there resources we could read to just be a general education to our patients who are very stuck in the Western medical model? And as a person that feels there's a lot more than that, I'm curious to what your perspective would be.
Well, one reason I brought several of these books, Robin Wall Kimmerer, 3 of her books are here: Braiding Sweetgrass, The Serviceberry, and Gathering Moss. She's Anishinaabe. You might know that as Ojibwe or Chippewa. But she is really masterful at writing about how plants are part of an entire relational system that is reciprocal. So it's not just about taking what one human needs for their health, but about how do you restore the health of the ecosystem? How do you live within that ecosystem? How do you selectively grow some of those plants in a way that can be used? So what I tend to recommend, this will sound odd, but in terms of medicine, a little is better than a lot. So find something that works and use it judiciously. And interestingly enough, that's also the tenet of homeopathic medicine. Small amounts of a substance are just as powerful as large amounts. One thing that I learned way, way back in the 1960s when I first started doing a lot of hiking in the Adirondacks is that you can actually build up an immunity to poison ivy by eating very small leaves of it. But I would never recommend anyone to do that. I tried it and it worked, but it's really easy to make it really bad if you get poison ivy by eating it or swallowing it. So sometimes there are lessons like that in the medicines themselves. So as a practitioner, I would say if you find, let's say, 1 or 2 or even 3 plants that work for you, use them in moderation. So I'll leave it there. Again, not prescribing. Yeah.
Hi, I think I may have heard you wrong when you were talking about boiling down the syrup. Did you say the syrup would spoil, so
Yes.
they'd have to process it further into sugar?
Exactly.
Is it like granulated sugar, and how did they do that?
Yeah, down to hard sugar.
How
Yeah.
would they make?
You just keep
How-
boiling it. Keep boiling and boiling. In fact, I'll show you that image because that's a good way to answer that. So maple syrup will go moldy if you're not careful. And so it gets boiled. And what you see here is a maple sugar mold. And so it's sherbage, the way we do it is we do the big boiling outside, so the initial sap. Then once it gets down about 10 to 1, then we take small amounts of syrup inside and keep boiling until you get this really thick glutinous mass. Then you pour it into a mold, either a big mold like this or small molds, and you let it sit. And here it's set up so there's a hole at the end of that mold so it can drain. And what you end up with is a hard sugar that will keep really well. And you can just grate off bits of it as you need it. Or if you put it down into molds, you can mold different things. So native people molded, maple leaves and bear paws and interesting shapes, even in the 16 and 1700s. Yeah.
I didn't know they could do that. Do sugarers, people?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There's only one way. Yeah, there's only one way to make maple sugar unless you add white sugar to it. If you want pure maple sugar, that's the only way to do it. Yeah.
Other
Sure.
questions? Did you have a question?
No, that fellow there.
Okay.
And I saw a hand in the back
Yeah,
too.
2 in the back and this fellow in the red shirt.
In fact, weren't you just making sugar this year? Yeah.
So I was interested to see the sassafras. I was a teenager growing up in Indiana, and there's sassafras all over. And as a Boy Scout, on a rainy day, if you want to build a fire, sassafras catches fire real easy.
And it smells great.
Yeah, but I haven't, 30-something years living in Northfield, I haven't seen that growing, so I'm interested if you can tell me how to find it.
There's a
in
lot
here.
of it in the valley. It likes having a lot of moisture, so often you'll find it at the edge of wetlands, and that's part of why it's so scarce now, because many wetlands were drained in order to create drier soil for building. So, but there's actually a lush body of it all along the, what's the French King Bridge? What's that road? Route 2? So all along the French King Bridge, it's hard to do now because of the high barriers, but if you stopped at those barriers and just looked out, you'd be looking right into sassafras trees. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah, they're wonderful. Yeah.
Thanks for a great presentation.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your research techniques. What sources did you tap to learn this and learn about these historical characters?
It's a long answer. I'll give you the short version. So when I started doing this research back in the 1990s, I had not yet returned to college, so I was doing a lot of work in tribal communities and meeting with elders who were native practitioners, a lot of work in town histories. Obviously, computer work was not easy in the 1990s. And I started to realize that there was a huge gap, and the gap was created not just between the indigenous knowledge practitioners and the academics, but also in terms of access to different kinds of archives. So one reason I actually went back to college in the 1990s to finish my degrees and finally go on from there was when I realized that to get into the archives I needed to get into, I had to have a master's or a PhD, and ideally I had to be associated with some important institution. And when I ended up at Penn, I was actually recruited to Penn, and once I became a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, it was as though all doors opened. So it was very interesting that the work I'd done on the ground corresponded with what I was able to find in the archives, but it took a lot of work piecing it all together. And when I said, in the early 1990s, when I said I was interested in researching Indian doctors and doctresses, I actually had advisors who said, oh, don't bother, there's nothing to find. And honestly, I'm the kind of researcher, if someone says that, oh yeah, I'm gonna go after it. You think it's not there? I'm gonna go try to find it. And so I joke about the way I learned research is the same way I learned hunting, because I grew up in a family of hunters and trappers and fishermen. And I learned that the way to find something is to understand where it lives, what it eats, who it associates with, how it moves, how it changes over time, what it looks like in different seasons. So whatever it is you're hunting, a plant, an animal, a bit of research, you work your way around, and once you've got all the surroundings, then you come closer and closer to what you're looking for. But if you just go straight after it, it will run away.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that in research as well as in hunting. So there you go. Oh, and actually, if you want another example of my research techniques, Meg mentioned I run a project called the Wampum Trail. So I have a website. If you just Google Wampum Trail and Bruchac, you'll find it. And I detail on that website. Do I have internet access here? Okay, I can find it for you later. But anyway, I detail on that website what we have found in various museum archives and collections and how to put it all together. And that project is a beautiful example of that research method, because I was asked specifically by tribal communities to go into museums to find wampum belts that they knew were there, but they couldn't get to because they didn't have the credentials. So, all right, I had another question back there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
your very interesting talk. You mentioned, I think, at the beginning of, at times in part 4, about a removal of, was it the Abenakis to Wisconsin?
No, the Mohican, Stockbridge Mohican.
Or,
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how that happened? Under what president was that, or was it? Do you know? Was it a
So
function
that
just
was
of the
actually
state?
a direct result of the American Revolution, oddly enough, because the Stockbridge Mohican, the town of Stockbridge was originally founded as an Indian town. And the idea was that Mohican people who lived in and around the Housatonic area wanted to live like the English. So in the 1730s, they asked Massachusetts as a commonwealth to set aside a town for them. And so Stockbridge originally was governed by both white and native people side by side. But when the revolution broke out, a number of Stockbridge Indians, who were really quite loyal, formed their own regiment, the Stockbridge Indian Regiment, and many of them died at the Battle of White Plains. And when they came home from war, they found that another branch of the Williams family, who founded Williams College, had actually very carefully maneuvered the land claims so that most of the land in and around the area was going to white families, wealthy white families, and wealthy white veterans rather than the Stockbridge. So that was part of what pushed them out. Initially, they were taken in, as you can see on this map, initially they were taken in by the Oneida in this place called New Stockbridge in central New York. But Oneida are Haudenosaunee people, and living among other tribal nations was difficult, so they started moving further and further. And it's a long story, but they were given land in Michigan that was taken away. They were given land elsewhere, and finally they landed in Wisconsin, which is where many of them live today. But I'm happy to say that quite recently, in the last few months, a large chunk of land in and around Williamstown has been given back to the Stockbridge. So they are coming back, and they now work closely with the Mission House Museum. So, yeah.
Katsiu Leonie, thank you so much, and thank you for the Wampum
You're
Trail.
very welcome. Yeah.
You talked about spirituality and how medicine and spirituality are connected. I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the personal items like the earrings and medicine bag that you wore, but how would you as Mali Geet take care of yourself? How does a practitioner in that time and tradition do self-care along with caring for others so much?
One of the interesting things I learned was that when I portrayed Mali Geet, I became a different person. Part of it is acting experience. Part of it was a strategy of living history. Any of you, I know there are several here who do living history. You can do it by talking about the past, wearing what people wore. You can do it by pretending to be those people. But Mali was never quite pretending. There was something about being Mali that made me very, very different. And the interpreters at the museum interacted with me in a very different way. And I spent a number of years training interpreters to interpret what Native people were like, even when they weren't present. And so in terms of spiritual protection, I wore some things like always a silver brooch at my neck, which you can probably see in this image, just a little brooch there. And that's actually a finger-woven belt made by my friend Six Fingers, who's long gone from us. And the top hat, I was surprised myself to find that so many Indian doctors and basket makers wore top hats. And I learned over time, it's actually quite practical. Keeps you cooler in warm weather, believe it or not, to have your head covered. Keeps your hair out of your face, you know, when you're walking along. But it also was distinctive. So when people wanted to find me, they would say, well, look for the woman wearing a top hat, because you won't see a man wearing a skirt, you know. And that was a classic 1830s, you know, descriptor. Other questions?
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah. I'm just going to grab some water.
What's all the Cajun medicine you hear about with some of that group down there? In the Cajun medicine that the people practice down in, say, Louisiana and that area?
I actually know very little about that. But what I can say is there's a really interesting mix, because when you get down to the southern states, what you get is a mix of native medicine, Appalachian folkways, and African American medicine and folkways, and they all kind of mingle in together. So it's interesting that down there, food is more medicinal than plants are in some ways. And that's about all I could say about it. So.
I think we've hit 7 o'clock. So do we have a final question, or are we good? You have one question. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I knew there was going to be some.
This is kind of an off-the-wall question, but how did Native people deal with bug bites and getting rid of mosquitoes and things like that? Because it's crazy.
So Molly used to love answering that question, because she would often answer it by saying, you know that term redskins? Where it comes from is that when the first Europeans came over, they met native people who were literally red in color, because you mix together bear grease, red ochre, which is iron oxide, and a variety of medicinal plants distilled down. You grease yourself up with that, and the insects will stay away. And another thing that works is if you have a really heavy tan, and your skin gets really well leathered. So you'll notice if you spend any time outside, any of you who work with your hands, you won't get bit on the hardest parts of your body, you know. There's just too hard to get through. And the other is that, believe it or not, insects were not quite as bad in certain areas. And so often you wouldn't travel in areas where the insects were the worst unless you were greased and leathered up in some way. So, and then of course there are some of the folks in the Adirondacks where I grew up who say, you know, you just don't wash for a couple of months and they'll keep everything away. Sorry, that's a bad note to end on.
All right.
Meg, you must have a question.
Well, okay, so you know me, and
Yeah.
for me it's all the textile history is
Yeah.
huge. And there was a through thread in your story, no pun intended, but recognized, about the basket makers and the other textile arts that wind up so prevalently in museum collections in that time, you know, in the era of that Molly Geek covers. And I would love to hear, here's my big burning question. It's about the souvenir market.
Oh, yeah.
And about how, I would love some insight from you and Molly and everybody attendant to that. Because we wind up, in all the collections that I've worked in, there are identifiable, oh, this is an Indian basket. Here's a bit of the Indian beadwork that was trade souvenir beadwork. And I would love a little piece of that to end on.
And the reason I pulled up this image is that there are baskets for sale, there are baskets for use, there are baskets for keeping, there are baskets for tossing. And one thing I have found to be a truism is almost every museum in New England, big or small, has at least one Indian basket. Almost. And often they know very little about them. And part of it is because, as you see the woman on the left here, Native people would peddle baskets at different times of year for different purposes. So up in Maine, it'd be potato baskets for the potato harvest. Down in Connecticut, it would be pie-shaped baskets for carrying pies, literally peddled door to door in season. This woman's carrying a lot of big utility baskets, as I'm carrying over there. And so the fact that they were so ubiquitous and so useful for all purposes made them almost invisible. Yeah. And it also made them, when they reached the end of their life, very good as fire starters. And so I found many, many accounts of people just using old baskets, just, get a good fire going. So there's a lot more work we could do on baskets. And one of the baskets I found in Deerfield, I don't have an image of it on this particular PowerPoint, but the Watso family that came, so Watso and Sedekis came to Deerfield in the 1830s. They sold baskets as well as doing medicine. And one basket that survived because it was given to a white girl who was a member of the Williams family from Eunice Williams, who had been taken captive in 1704. And so she had been taken in by the Mohawk, but also had kin among the Abenaki. And so the bottom of the basket, and I'll tell you, I had to have a degree before I could get a curator to turn the basket over so I could look at the bottom. And when she finally did, on the bottom it said, "Basket given me by Sophie, one of the St. Francis Indians who was here in 1837." Very, very specific. But for decades, that basket, when it was on display in the museum, simply said, "Basket belonged to the Williams family." Wow. Given to Helen Sheldon, property of Helen Sheldon Wells. So that's another thing that happens, is that baskets and souvenirs become, they end up in collections with the name of the people who own them, not the people who made them. So there's a lot of really good work being done now to recover stories of makers.
That's great.
Yeah.
Let's end there, but let's talk
That's a good,
more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.